Last week, I finally started developing the core mechanic for the indie narrative chance game that I'm currently solo developing. Unfortunately, within minutes of finishing the mechanic, I suddenly realised that everything was working technically, but I didn't like it. I wasn't having fun. That's when I made one small shift in the design, which entirely changed how the mechanic felt and how I felt about the entire game, really. But before we get to that, how did everything go wrong to begin with? A choice system where the outcome is decided on the roll of the dice. That's all I had. One small sentence. Being a solo developer and wearing the designer hat and the programmer hat, I needed to be more specific about this mechanic before I dived into Unreal. The plan was pretty simple. Just specify the mechanic, get a dice roll working in Unreal, paper block out the gameplay, and then build the layers in the systems to get something playable. For me, designing good systems is about breaking them down into layers. I start with the absolute foundation of those mechanics and the features they require, and then build upwards on them, making sure that you account for interconnected systems and future functionality. It makes you think practically about what the mechanic actually needs later on, and it can save you a lot of technical headache and redoing work in the future. For this mechanic, a player will be given some choices on screen, with odds displayed for those choices. They could then select and use items to alter the odds of that being successful. They would then roll the dice and see the outcome. Now that I had an idea of what I was making and a to-do list, the probabilities of a dice roll were going to be the backbone of every choice made in the game. So something I wanted to get done first and make sure that I was happy with before I started working on the rest of the game. I'm definitely not a maths expert. I can clearly recall in school hating probability maths because I just didn't understand it. And so this process was actually quite a lot of fighting ChatGPT generated equations, trying to figure out how I could actually calculate the probabilities efficiently and consistently. The one part I didn't expect to be hard was actually figuring out which way the dice landed in the world. I planned to do a dot product system with rotational maths, but I couldn't get it to work the way I wanted to. And so I gave up on that system and went for a much simpler, in many ways stupider system by just having a series of points on each face of the die, and then whichever point was highest when the roll finished, that was the face that was up. Sometimes the simplest and stupidest solutions work the best. But this wasn't a mechanic yet. I had a dice rolling, but I need to figure out what the actual gameplay was. What would the player be doing? Technically a Miro block out for the stream. This is where I just play the game in my imagination using some helpful paper tools to see if it works. You need to think about the player experience and the planned outcome and whether your design is hitting those goals. I think the problem I had here was I focused too much on the technical part. Because I'm not used to being the lead programmer on my projects, I'm normally a designer. I was so focused on making systems that worked efficiently and had good programming basis, I didn't spend the time considering the fun element so much. I think that was the mistake I made that led to the lack of fun that I experienced later on. But then, without the power of hindsight, I trucked on with making it, thinking that everything was going very smoothly. I just worked through the to-do list one layer at a time, the choice interaction UI, the item data structures, the player inventory, displaying usable items on those choices, selecting the number of items and which items you use, taking all that data and updating the odds with those items. Because I'd already planned those design layers and the data structures that need to be passed through, actually programming it was quite easy for me, and it was going really smoothly, and I was really happy with the progress, I was really happy with the design flow. But playing the mechanic over and over and over again, as I was adding those features, there started to be a little voice in the back of my mind going, is this fun? Is this actually the outcome that I wanted? Is this the game I wanted to make? If the outcome failed, it was basically never satisfying. I had planned for this moment of tension when you were rolling the dice to see if it would succeed or fail, and I planned for the game to provide fun and interesting outcomes on the failed dice as well as the successful ones. But when I was looking through the design and thinking about that game in reality, I realised that things failing were just punishing the player and not giving them the fun story that I had imagined. Playing the game felt like I was watching a mediocre movie and not playing a fun interactive game. And I will admit, at this point, I fell into a teeny pit of despair, wanting to tear everything up and start again. I'm sure anyone that is creative has had that experience on projects before. So if you have any pity for me, you can always like and subscribe. Makes me feel much better. I thought about what the design might be missing. It was that level of interactivity. There was no intervention from the player on the outcome, apart from choosing items to use beforehand. I needed some way for the player to turn their tide against the odds, beyond just random luck. My first thought was some kind of reroll system where players could roll again, or use some kind of currency to change the roll or add to the roll, but that all felt a bit convoluted and a bit dull, to be honest. And that's when I came up with the smash mechanic. The ability to throw the dice and then in mid-air, smash them down to the table to lock in their roll. This means that suddenly there's a player skill expression, a way for the player to use their own timing and skill to overcome the odds and succeed. It's a tiny addition mechanically. Everything I built was still working and still functioning and would still be in the game, but this tiny addition suddenly added tension and player experience and player interaction into every single dice roll in the game. The player was no longer just sitting waiting for an animation to finish, they were actively taking part in the action. It wasn't a huge redesign, it was one tiny simple decision to focus on player experience. And that one tiny change from passive experience to active interaction completely changed how I felt about the game.